Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Awesome. So thanks again for joining me. Honored to have you here. I read that you were born in 87 in Minsk, in Belarusia, and then moved to the United States at the age of 9. And so I'm wondering how time spent there during the Soviet Union's transition marked a significant point in your life as a child, and if that meant anything to you.
I think it did, and it did in the following ways. First of all, I have less status quo bias than most people would because I have seen systems change. I have seen extreme societal change during my childhood. And I have seen essentially that many aspects of life that people take for granted as being stable or unchanging are in fact quite volatile and quite capable of changing dramatically, not just during the course of a lifetime, but during the course of a few years. And when I came to the United States, I saw many cultural norms that were different from those in Belarus or the former Soviet Union. And I saw both advantages and disadvantages to those cultural norms. So some aspects of life were clear improvements, other aspects of life, not so much. And what I learned very early on is not to accept anything wholesale as a singular package, but rather to differentiate among aspects that I find more favorable, aspects that I find less favorable, and use my critical thinking faculty to distinguish between them. And I think this has helped me to essentially formulate my own independent understanding of the world, my own personal culture even, as I sometimes like to call it, because I don't just accept what is given. I don't just conform to the environment or the society that I'm in. I try to figure out what is actually the best course of action and what flaws can be fixed, what ways are there to improve upon existing systems.
Right. And so in some sense, sort of your tumultuous upbringing and transition, I'm guessing sort of guided you into sort of seeking science and reason and technology. I figure played somewhat of a part in it, right?
Yes. Well, what are some principles that are timeless, that work across societies, that transcend mere cultural norms? Science and technology are definitely among them, because if, for instance, you build a bridge using sound engineering principles, whether you build it in the former Soviet Union or in the United States or in Zimbabwe, that bridge is going to still serve its purpose. Likewise, if you have a medical treatment and it's applied to a particular person, that treatment is going to work even if that person is from a different country, even if that person has had a different lifestyle, for instance. But whether or not that treatment works, obviously, is based on objective facts of biology. And those objective facts of biology can be understood through scientific pursuit, essentially. So I do think that there are principles that transcend time and space and culture. They're not merely subjective or intersubjectively agreed upon. They are objective laws of nature that we can understand and we can use for our benefit.
Exactly. And so you moved to the US and decided to earn a Bachelor of Science at Hillsdale. You studied mathematics, economics, and German. Very interesting combination of fields, I would say. Before I dive into that a little bit, why German in addition to sort of rigorous fields like economics and mathematics?
Historical path dependency. So what happened was that I had originally embarked upon studying economics as a major and mathematics as my minor, but I quickly realized I had enough credits to pursue a full-fledged mathematics major, and I was taking one German course per semester, essentially also realizing I could do a German minor, and I thought, very well, I'll be spending 4 years in college anyway, so I might as well get my money's worth. And then my third year of college, my German professor approached me, and I had some advanced placement credits as well. And he told me essentially, if you take one German course per semester as you have been taking thus far, that will suffice to get you a German major. So you might as well do a German major. However, the official course sequence essentially ran out of courses for me to take. So I had to work with the German professor to design essentially custom seminars where we studied German literature, mostly classic German literature from the 18th and 19th centuries. So think Goethe, Schiller, a little bit of German philosophy, Kant, of course. And that was an interesting experience, certainly, to delve deeply into the literature. And of course, I have also delved considerably into the Austrian School of Economics. So that was a nice supplement since Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek obviously were conversant in German and wrote their earlier works in German, though they both, of course, emigrated to the United States. So I think it was for general enrichment and my tendency to be a completionist. So if I embark upon a particular path, I want to get the most out of it, especially if I have the time to do it.
Very interesting. So I guess it does serve a function in terms of studying the economics. And I know German's a pretty hard language as well. It's certainly not easy. So how did this sort of multidisciplinary approach to even you and your undergrad sort of define your later work?
Well, I think I gravitated as a result of this interdisciplinary approach to the general worldview of the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment didn't recognize these strict boundaries among disciplines the way that they exist in contemporary academia. The idea among most of the philosophers of the Enlightenment was that all knowledge is interrelated, all knowledge is ultimately about the same reality, just perhaps studying different aspects of it or in different ways with different focuses, but there are bridges that can be built across disciplines and ways to integrate these disciplines to form a more complete understanding of the human condition. And this is extremely important because, of course, in the 20th century, we had an age of hyper-specialization, and there have been so many people who were narrowly specialized in certain disciplines, and they know or knew a lot about a comparatively small fraction of human activity. And that's essentially what the contemporary PhD program is about. You learn more and more about less and less. And then, of course, the challenge is, how do you take that knowledge, which could be valuable knowledge, it could have very valuable applications, but in the silo in which it was generated, it cannot really readily be applied yet unless you have people who are generalists or who are knowledgeable in other disciplines who recognize the value of that knowledge or that skill set that was generated. So I thought essentially to move humankind forward, one needs to have this integrated approach, and there need to be more people who know something in a large number of fields. And then they can take that information and at least direct others in terms of actually harnessing that information. So, for example, I'm not a biologist, I am not a medical researcher, but I know a lot of biologists and I know a lot of medical researchers, and I'm sufficiently conversant with what they do that I can understand its broader societal significance, and I can connect them with people in other disciplines who could help broaden the reach of their advances.
Right. It does serve you very well to take sort of a polymathic approach these days. And I think we'll get to part of the reason why that might be even more necessary in the future. So you're an actuary and sort of you assessed financial risks using mathematical models. I'm wondering what drove you to that. You're very highly credentialed one at that, but what drove you to that to begin with in your early career?
Very pragmatic considerations. So, of course, this is a career path that aligns with my college majors, but I also saw the pitfalls of going to graduate school. Actually, still my most popular YouTube video is from January 2011. It's entitled Reasons Not to Pursue a PhD. So if anybody wants to find out my thinking about that in detail, please watch that video. But even earlier than that, in 2006, after attending a session hosted by my economics professors who described their experiences in graduate school, I realized the opportunity cost of that path is huge. And the effort involved is comparable to a full-time job, certainly, but less remunerative, less rewarding. And again, it seemed to me the outcome with a PhD is you know more and more about less and less. And I also realized to achieve outcomes in the real world, one needs to have resources. So I needed to find a way to finance my polymathic pursuits, essentially. So the choice to have a remunerative career right out of college essentially arose out of my desire to generate this funding mechanism. And I was exploring what careers were out there that could help me achieve that. And a lot of the other careers are similarly unappealing because one has to undertake a lengthy course of study and go into a lot of debt to reach a high earning potential. In particular, with law school and medical school, students will sometimes get into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And essentially, they would be about my age in their mid 30s by the time they actually reach a positive net worth, even though their incomes could be substantial at that point in time. So I wanted to find a career where I did not have to go into the financial hole, where I could earn while I learn. And the actuarial field offers that because one can take exams, and indeed that's the expectation after one completes one's undergraduate studies, that one would pursue actuarial exams. And now there are various online courses and modules through self-study. And this is a flexible career choice because the exams are offered generally several times per year. One can pursue them at one's own pace. So if one needs to take a break for whatever reason, or even if one doesn't pass an exam, because these are some of the most rigorous and most difficult exams in the world, that is still a possibility. And on average, it takes people about 10 years from the time they begin to the time they get fully credentialed. So the ultimate credential that I received is the FSA or Fellow of the Society of Actuaries, but I have various other professional insurance designations, 10 in total, because I pursued not just actuarial exams, but for instance, exams in areas like underwriting and reinsurance and insurance regulation and compliance, and those helped me as well in my career. But when I was in my second year of college, I realized I could start on the actuarial exam path. And in addition to my full course load, which ended up transforming into 3 majors, I studied for actuarial exams on the side. And in 2007, I began to study for the first exam, which was exam P on probability. And essentially, I used my breaks in between courses, I used my lunch breaks, I used my evenings and my weekends to practice problems that would be offered on the exam. And I reached out to Dr. Marcel Feinen of Arkansas Tech University because he had written essentially the first free actuarial study guide for exam P. And he had a lot of practice problems. They were very helpful, but he did not have step-by-step solution keys to each of the problems. So I wanted to make sure I did the problems correctly. And so I emailed him and I essentially made him an offer. The offer was, I saw he didn't have the detailed solution keys, so I would write the solution keys for him. In exchange, he would review my work and tell me if it was correct. And he agreed to do that. And I did this for essentially 3 months while I was studying for the exam. Then I took exam P and I got a score of 10 out of 10. So it's graded on a curve, of course. So a score of 10 doesn't mean you got all the answers correct, but it is the highest score available on that exam. And I realized, all right, I'm pretty good at this. So I will keep going. And I kept taking actuarial exams. It is easier to take them in college because they are synergistic with one's other studies. So I was taking courses in statistics and mathematical economics, for instance, and that definitely helped. It helped to be heavily steeped in math, in advanced calculus, for instance. So I'm glad I did that. By the time I graduated from college, I had passed 4 actuarial exams, and this was actually just enough to qualify me for my first actuarial job right out of college, right in the trough of the Great Recession. And sometimes I felt like everything I was doing in college, well, it was clearly extra, nobody else was doing it. But looking at what actually happened and looking at how high the bar was raised during the Great Recession to get a remunerative job right out of college, I realized I did just enough. And I happened to plan ahead and build in that extra studying, those extra pursuits into my activities, which enabled me to have the path that I subsequently did. But if I had just done what was expected of me or what was expected of people of my generation, that would not have happened. And I think my path in life would have been very different. But once you do something like that, once you get into a field like that, and especially reach the ultimate credential in the field, essentially you keep going. That's the path dependency aspect of it.
Right. So if there's a core idea I've taken from that, it's that I shouldn't go to graduate school. Interesting. So is there any part of your actuarial role that's sort of tied into your broader interest in policy and technology?
Well, actuaries, of course, have to be experts in assessing risk, and risk underlies all of our activities. If you think about what kinds of risk are insurable, there is just such a variety. So, of course, most people will have automobile insurance policies or home insurance policies or health insurance policies, though I myself am a property and casualty actuary by specialty. But there's also, say, workers' compensation insurance if you get injured on the job, or medical malpractice insurance for doctors or nurses or other medical practitioners who commit errors and there's some patient harm resulting from that. So, working in this field of insurance, one has to have a grasp of developments in the broader society and an understanding of what affects the risk of loss. And certainly there are many influences, but technology is a key influence because it can reduce risks to a great extent, but there could also be some offsetting risks that arise. So, an example that I like to use is the arrival of the automobile. So, right now in the United States, unfortunately, about 40,000 people a year die from automobile accidents. Now, does that mean the automobile was a bad invention, that it shouldn't have been introduced? No, because the automobile resolved many other problems and risks and direct harms that people were experiencing. For instance, in the horse and buggy era, when there were hundreds of thousands of horses in major cities, there was an enormous biohazard problem, I'll put it that way. And there was actually serious concern about how that was affecting people's health. Many people died from infectious diseases as a result of that. So the automobile, even if you grant that it causes some pollution, save people from that problem. Now, there are forthcoming technological advancements that are either on the horizon or already being deployed with autonomous vehicles that can save most of the lives that are currently claimed in automobile accidents today. About 95% of all accidents are the result of human error. So if autonomous vehicles can prevent those accidents, we would be much better off. Are they a perfect technology? No, we have seen instances where autonomous vehicles have failed to perceive aspects of the external world that a human driver could readily perceive. And I think a lot of people are afraid of those kinds of situations, even though they are rare outliers compared to all of those instances where the autonomous vehicles work well. So when you're looking at risks, it helps to have a quantitative skill set. It helps to have a sense of proportionality and historical perspective. And when I've spoken to actuarial audiences or broader insurance audiences, I have made the distinction between an actuary and a quant. So a quant is someone who is good at math, who analyzes various financial metrics, for instance, and has a skill set that allows sophisticated analysis. But a quant may not have that fundamental understanding of the underlying reality, that qualitative understanding, which economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Karl Menger, for instance, really emphasize, because the Austrian school is not primarily about quantitative analysis, though it doesn't reject quantitative analysis. It's about a qualitative understanding of the underlying rationale, the reasons, the principles behind a particular phenomenon. So Ludwig von Mises built his entire theory on this action axiom. So human beings act to remedy felt dissatisfaction or felt uneasiness, as he described it. So that allows us to essentially have a framework of understanding these phenomena, not just measuring them, not just observing correlations, but considering why they happen and what could change so that they happen in a different way, so that they affect our society in a different direction or set of directions. So I think that has helped me a lot. But to be a competent actuary, one definitely needs to seek that fundamental understanding. Though I would say, of course, the desire for the fundamental understanding precedes my actuarial career. It's more of essentially a desire to fathom the world, but also to improve the world and resolve the many suboptimalities that I've perceived in it since my early childhood, as we've discussed.
Right. So I think it gives you sort of a pragmatic grounding in real world risks, right, to an extent. So you've had that part of your life, and simultaneously in parallel, you've been sort of pursuing and writing about ideas about technology, the future, and you've been a prominent figure since the early 2000s, but you founded the Rational Argumentator, which was a journal for Western man, as you called it. And so I'm wondering, you focused a lot on sort of the transhumanism philosophical movement. What brought you to that? What was the initial spark for you that sort of led you in that direction?
So the Rational Argumentator, interestingly, is now about 21 and a half years old. So I founded it in late August of 2002. And the idea was I saw the internet as having this tremendous potential to be a repository of knowledge. Keep in mind, this was a very optimistic time during the early internet when Yahoo GeoCities was a common platform. And instead of social media where you could just essentially copy and paste something into a post and it appears in everyone's feeds, everyone had to custom design their own websites. And that gave a kind of creative expression, not just in terms of the content, but in terms of the style, the structure, the presentation. And I did that as well with the Rational Argumentator because there was no other choice for getting my ideas out there. But I saw that I could actually add my thoughts and my ideas and other people's ideas as well, because I did contact a variety of authors and I got their permission to republish their articles. And I could memorialize that within an archive that people could access potentially indefinitely. And back then, getting published was still a big deal because most of the avenues for getting published were through commercial publishers, the gatekeepers. Sometimes one could self-publish, but one needed money for that, and I didn't have a lot of money as a high school student. So I saw this as just this amazing way to get ideas out there, to express them, and to start changing people's minds, shifting people's worldviews toward what I thought would be a new age of enlightenment based on the ready availability and accessibility of information. So again, this was a very optimistic time where a lot of people during the early internet, not just I, but so many others thought that if you only remove these institutional barriers to knowledge, if you only bypass the gatekeepers and you made information and knowledge freely available to everybody, then truth would win out over falsehood. People would clearly see what is true. They would access this free information because who wouldn't? I mean, books were expensive, but people bought books and people read books. So if you made the information free, if you lowered the cost of it, of course, more people would access more of it. And we would have a rapid transformation society for the better. Now, the reality did not quite turn out that way, and we can discuss why later on, but it was a real impetus for me. And actually, during the early internet, I saw the impacts of my work very quickly because, of course, comparatively, not that many people were engaged in this kind of self-publication activity. So it was still a self-selecting group, generally a more erudite group. But I was on the debate team in high school, and I published certain articles on policy issues that interested me. And within a fairly short amount of time, I saw debaters from other schools essentially citing me and my articles as their authority for various positions that they were arguing. And I was gratified by that. And then I appeared at those debate tournaments, and some of them pointed out, well, I looked an awful lot like this person they were citing because I had my portrait up on the early iterations of the rational argumentator. So information did spread more easily back then. I think because it was a less crowded field in part, and in part because this technology of online publication was so new that by virtue of engaging in that field, one was on the cutting edge. So that was essentially the initial spark for the rational argumentator. And what has kept it going, it has transformed over the years. I think with the rise of social media, it has changed from just putting knowledge out there and hoping that people would become enlightened or very quickly transformed by it, to rather having a venue that is a bastion of high intellectual standards and that tries to essentially focus on what is important, on essentially the ideas, the principles that can guide the betterment of the human species. I think that is still a fundamental goal of mine, but now there's a lot more noise that we have to navigate through in order to reach that goal.
Right. For anyone listening to this, it's an absolute treasure trove, and I think you should definitely go give it a read. A bunch of amazing articles. I mean, it's just remarkable. It's a beautiful repository, I think, of your work, and it'll be something that'll be really nice to look back at maybe a couple decades from now, and be grateful that you were so in on the early internet like that. It's remarkable. I guess there's a purity to that internet that definitely doesn't exist now. And so that sort of served as a springboard for you in doing more writing, and you wrote a children's book called Death is Wrong, arguing, remarkable children's book, arguing that it's unnecessary and unethical. It employs simple language. It's easy to understand for young kids. There's a lot of visuals in it, which are also really, really valuable in terms of understanding these ideas, because they can be somewhat complex sometimes, right? So what was your intended message in writing this book? What was it that you were trying to show people?
My intended message was to reach children who, like me, refuse to accept death as normal or natural or justified. And I would say this applies to most children. When they first learn about human mortality, their reaction is a combination of outrage, sadness, fear, because why do good people who have done nothing wrong or nothing seriously wrong have to be sentenced to a fate of non-existence? And yet they are met with many consolations or cultural justifications for death, which are understandable as coping mechanisms, given that during the vast majority of our history, mortality really was inevitable. Scientific progress was just insufficiently far along for us to be able to do very much about it. So how do you keep going day to day, essentially, and not lapse into despair? So these coping mechanisms are understandable, but at some point in the advancement of our civilization, they become detrimental, because if a viable possibility exists that we could actually overcome this problem, then the large portion of our efforts and energies should be devoted toward that. And I want to motivate young people, instead of accepting death, to try to fight it, essentially. And the way to do it is to reach them early in life, because while a lot of people come across transhumanism or the ideas of the longevity movement, the writings of scientists such as Dr. Aubrey de Grey or Dr. Bill Andrews, both of whom are good friends of mine, they come across those ideas and those publications later in life, once essentially the core of their worldview has been formed. And there are some people whose worldviews are quite conducive to accepting those ideas, but there are others who have been culturally conditioned to such an extent that there's a lot of resistance. And there's a lot of these rationalizations, essentially, the idea that death is normal or natural or the will of God or the cycle of life, to wade through and to overcome before they can take the prospect of indefinite longevity seriously. So if one reaches them earlier, the probability that they would be more receptive to these ideas later on is maximized. And I also think that for kids who are inconsolable, like I was, it would be good for them to know that they are not alone. that there are people who agree with them, that they are working toward the same goal of overcoming mortality. And if these kids are interested in becoming scientists, technologists, advocates, philosophers, activists, whatever skill set they have that is most conducive to this cause, then they're welcome to do that. They're welcome to join our movement, which I think is the noblest and most ambitious cause in the history of our civilization. So hopefully this book will inspire them. Now, Death is Wrong is a bit over 10 years old now, and it does need some updates based on more recent developments, both in science and in terms of the activist front. The Transhumanist Party, for example, was formed in 2014. And I'm actually hoping that this year a computer game called Death is Wrong will be released as well. A friend of mine named Adam Alonzi is working with me and a team of programmers on it. And the first level of this game, it's a Mario Brothers style platformer game, essentially, is almost ready. It will be released, I think, very soon. And it will be hopefully motivation to crowdfund the rest of the game. But that's another way of reaching young people, computer games, which has become increasingly accessible these days compared to, of course, when I first started out with the Rational Argumentator, where really text publication was the only option for someone seeking to spread ideas.
Right. So, I mean, as an avid gamer, I'm certainly going to be one of the first few to get that game. I think that's a really good way and sort of adapting and trying to get these ideas to a younger generation. I'm certainly going to push it as much as I possibly can. I love that. So in addition to writing, you then, as you mentioned earlier, in 2014, the Transhumanist Party was founded. And in 2016, you became the chairman of the Transhumanist Party. I'm wondering what sort of the biggest successes and challenges have been during your leadership.
So the biggest successes, of course, have been the growth of the Transhumanist Party. We have about 4,400 members now, and we started with 3 because the founder, Zoltan Istvan, essentially ran it personally, and it was mostly essentially a rallying point around his personal activities, but I opened it up to membership among the general public. We've had a large amount of publicity, but not so much sensational publicity, but in-depth publicity, in-depth intellectual engagement, the kind of conversation that you and I are having, except multiplied by, let's say, 3 orders of magnitude. That, I would say, is the greatest accomplishment, the ability to go into depth on these issues consistently and systematically. I host on my YouTube channel our weekly virtual enlightenment salons every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time, where for about an hour and 54 minutes, we go into depth in an interdisciplinary manner on a variety of intellectual topics with often experts in particular disciplines, but we get the experts to branch out a bit as well so that the conversations are quite unique. So the virtual enlightenment salons are definitely an achievement. We have had a legislative success in the state of Nevada in 2019, where we were able to achieve a revision to one of the pieces of legislation that was proposed, Assembly Bill 226, which in the manner that it was proposed, would have infringed upon the rights of people to voluntarily augment themselves through microchip implants. And there were a lot of misconceptions about these microchip implants, the NFC or RFID tags. Some people were worried that they could be used to spy on people remotely, for instance, but they don't actually have that capability. They have essentially a requirement that one be in extreme proximity to them in order to be able to scan them or interact with them. So a mobile phone is a much easier device to use to track people. And if somebody wanted to do that, and some entities already do, they could use a mobile phone quite more easily than these RFID or NFC tags. So we had an educational challenge before the Nevada legislature, and we held the first ever cyborg and transhumanist forum before any sort of legislative body, where we essentially had some tables in the lobby of the Nevada legislature, and people would come by, including some legislators, lobbyists, staff members, and the reception was uniformly positive, and the legislators just decided to amend the bill based on a more accurate understanding of what these technologies were or were not capable of doing. So that was a major achievement. We've had, of course, two presidential campaigns since I became chairman. One was with Charlie Cam as our presidential nominee and Liz Parrish, the vice presidential nominee. Liz Parrish is, of course, quite famous as being the first person to ever receive a combination gene therapy aimed at alleviating aspects of biological aging. And now for 2024, we have our ticket of Tom Ross as our presidential nominee, Daniel Tweed as our vice presidential nominee. So that has garnered some publicity for the transhumanist cause. And I would say really the major enduring accomplishment of the Transhumanist Party is just to show people that politics can be done differently. So politics in the mainstream of the Republicans and the Democrats, the duopoly essentially, is extremely polarized, extremely adversarial. One tribe, the red tribe versus the other tribe, the blue tribe. And there is this demonization of half of the American population, whichever tribe you happen to belong to. The other tribe has to be evil and is out there to subvert American democracy or American values or what have you. And there's so little opportunity to actually solve problems because the duopoly has turned politics into this kind of zero-sum us versus them dynamic. So the Transhumanist Party shows that a different way is possible, a focus on the issues, a focus on transcending these wedge issues that dominate political discourse today and seeing how science and technology can actually solve those problems. And of course, in terms of actually getting elected, we've run some campaigns, also some campaigns at the local level. So we've run a campaign for Jennifer Hughes, who was a mayoral candidate in Camden, New Jersey. And she was actually the first candidate in several decades to challenge the Democratic Party monopoly over Camden politics. And she got enough petition signatures to qualify on the ballot to beat back a challenge to those petition signatures and to run a good race. She didn't win, but she did essentially rattle some of the incumbents in that jurisdiction. But in addition to that, I think winning is not so much the object. The object is spreading ideas. The object is showing people what is possible if we focus on technology, if we focus on rationality, if we focus on transcending differences, seeing these issues in a new way, rather than entrenching these differences.
Right. That's very interesting. It's remarkable the amount of work that's been done. And sort of one of the key aspects of your leadership has been the development of the Transhumanist Party platform for democratic input. And you're using ranked preference voting to select and refine platform planks. I'm wondering what some of the considerations and challenges were in designing that.
So ranked preference voting is excellent as a way to get people to express their actual preferences because, of course, they get to rank order all of the options. And if their preferred option doesn't win, their vote gets reallocated to their second choice. And then if that doesn't win, then their vote gets reallocated to their third choice. So it is definitely a more refined way of getting people to reveal their entire preference set rather than just their top option. Because if they only reveal their top option, then there's a lot of incentive for strategic voting, for trying to envision, well, who's likely to win or what option is likely to win and what option do I really not want to win, in which case I'll be more inclined to vote against that option rather than vote for what I really want, but I might not think that has any chance of winning. So if ranked preference voting were implemented nationwide in the United States, we wouldn't have a duopoly anymore. We would have a multi-party system, the way that it exists in a lot of other jurisdictions and a lot of European parliamentary democracies or in countries like Australia, which use ranked preference voting. So it's definitely intended to be a proof of concept. One aspect where the Transhumanist Party even goes beyond what is typically done is that we don't just use ranked preference voting for candidates, we use it for wording of our platform positions. And this is how the current Transhumanist Party platform arose, as well as the Transhumanist Party, Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0. So the first version was written by Zoltan Istvan, but versions 2.0 and 3.0 were developed through the democratic input of our members. And what ends up happening with ranked preference voting is generally the options that are selected, they tend to be more moderate, at least within the group that is doing the voting, and more palatable to all members of the group. So essentially the option that wins, it may not have been everyone's first choice, but for most people, it's not their last choice. For most people, it's an option that they could live with and that they find some merit in. So I have noticed in terms of the support that our platform has received among our members, it's almost never just beyond the margin of a majority vote. So it's almost never like 51% or 55%. It's closer to 80%. And that shows that our members are generally pleased with the outcome of the ranked preference voting. I wouldn't be surprised if that were incorporated into broader policy making and decision making in the United States, if American voters would also be a lot more satisfied with the political system and with policies as reflecting their actual preferences.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. It sort of shows and demonstrates this sort of interest in synthesizing ideas into practice, which I think we don't do enough of these days. You've shown that sort of impulse, I think, throughout your career, which is remarkable. You've done a ton of sort of future-driven writing, working on things like AI, futuristic philosophy, economics. Of all your articles, which there are a lot of, and a lot of very interesting ones, are there any that are significant to you in a way that others might not be?
Well, I tend to favor those writings of mine which express some thoughts that I haven't seen expressed anywhere else. And one of the essays of mine that I can recommend is entitled, How Can I Live Forever? What Does and Does Not Preserve the Self? Because I think it lays out some unique positions, even within the transhumanist or life extensionist community, because I delve into significant depth about which transformations of the human body actually preserve what I call the I-ness, which is one's unique individual vantage point upon the world. And this is something that is not often thought about as thoroughly as I think it should be. So, for instance, there are some proponents of mind uploading who might favor, let's say, copying approach. So if you have your pattern instantiated in a computer or in an android body, and it might look like you, it might talk like you, it might think it's you, but is it necessarily you? If your biological self dies and there's not some sort of continuity in that individual organism. So that's an interesting question to address. And my essay delves into it. What is, I think, quite important about it from a methodological standpoint is it shows the importance and relevance of philosophy and the kind of philosophy that is accessible to an educated layperson without having to perform scientific experiments in the lab. So a lot of people think to discover something about the natural world or about the empirical world, about how things are, you have to do an experiment. And that's not necessarily the case. Of course, it's often the case. But sometimes if the phenomenon in question is sufficiently general and one has access to it through what I call ubiquitous observation, then sufficiently rigorous thinking about that phenomenon could produce valuable conclusions. For instance, I ask, well, does one's I-ness get preserved when one sleeps? And clearly through ubiquitous experience, it seems that it does. Does one's I-ness get preserved through anesthesia? It seems that it does. Does one's I-ness get preserved if one is in a coma and is resuscitated from the coma? It seems that it does, because the underlying biological processes still continue. Does one's I-ness get preserved if one is placed in a kind of suspended animation and one's bodily processes are actually stopped, but then they're resumed. That's where some of the interesting questions start to arise. So I would recommend that essay as an exercise in thinking about these concepts. Now, I have a lot of interesting science fiction, especially some of my actuarial science fiction, I would actually recommend to a broader audience because it addresses, let's say, certain interesting situations and certain premises that I think are worthy of further exploration, or at least will give you a kind of intellectual adventure. So, two of my recent short stories are called The Whales Technique and Career Advice. And I will just say career advice was written during the height of the COVID pandemic, but I won't give away the plot of that story. And my latest short story is called How Many Actuaries Does It Take to Change a Light Bulb? And it is a story that involves a dialogue with ChatGPT, except the professor who essentially was giving feedback on the story for the actuarial fiction contest to which I submitted it said he could not distinguish whether this story involved an actual use of ChatGPT or essentially a clever parody of one. So I'll leave that to the reader to decide what you think is the reality with that story.
Very interesting. I will definitely give those two a read. I have read the ChatGPT one. So speaking of sort of science fiction writing, you've written a novel called Eden Against Colossus, which sort of explores a future where nanorobots inhabit every human brain and help optimize the world. I'm wondering, what is it about that? What's the message, the core message you were trying to get across in that novel?
So Eden Against the Colossus actually is an exploration of this outlook that I had formed early in my life, that one cannot just accept one's surrounding culture as given, as automatically good. Because I have encountered many arguments, essentially, of the cultural relativist persuasion that essentially say, well, you need to accept all cultures on their terms, and there's no objective basis for judging them, for distinguishing what is good or bad. Who are you to say that they should be improved in some respects? So, in this novel, there are actually several cultures that are suboptimal. The human culture in this novel is essentially beset by this kind of relativistic thinking that threatens to undermine the achievements of the intergalactic civilization that had emerged. But there's also a culture of aliens, at least we think that they're aliens, that have been essentially conditioned to not perceive the physical world, the objective reality at all. Instead, they perceive gradations of this mystical object that they call the Quisly. And their entire language, their routines, their life patterns revolve around trying to reach higher gradations of the Quisly. But they end up essentially destroying themselves in that quest. So there's this idea explored in the novel that there are cultural norms, there are entrenched approaches to life that are institutionalized within entire societies that could actually be detrimental and self-destructive, and that it takes a determined individual or a determined movement of individuals who challenge those norms and who perhaps can get people to adopt better approaches, more life-affirming approaches, approaches that are more consistent with the external reality. So it is very much, let's say, a small o objectivist kind of novel. I did, of course, immerse myself quite extensively in Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, but I have some differences with it, and I've explained those differences in some of my writings as well as my video, Objectivism, Strengths and Weaknesses. But a lot of the fundamental ideas, like the fact that there is an objective reality, it can be understood through reason, and it is the reason of the individual, the rational individual mind, that is necessary and sufficient to understand that objective reality. So people need to have the freedom to pursue that understanding and the ability to innovate, be it scientifically and technologically or philosophically, in order to reach that correct understanding. So that's what the novel is about. It's a kind of science fiction mystery novel. Again, I won't give away too much of the plot, but again, if you're looking for an intellectual adventure, this is one avenue to have one.
Another incredible read, I must say. How do you see sort of fiction writing as a whole as a tool for sort of futurist thought? Because it's an incredibly powerful one.
Yes, I think it's important to consider that a lot of the actual technological advancements that we have were first envisioned by science fiction authors going back all the way to Jules Verne, but certainly science fiction authors during the golden age of science fiction, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, played an important role in shaping our contemporary society. If you think of the Star Trek series, a lot of the technologies envisioned in it are with us today. This is a more advanced version of the pad from Star Trek, for example. And if you look back at 2001, A Space Odyssey, people were talking via these video phones. What we are doing right now is a more advanced version of that. So to envision the possibility of the future being dramatically different from the present, I think is important to motivate people to do something about the future. Now, not all science fiction is hopeful. Some science fiction is dystopian or cautionary, and there can be good dystopian science fiction. For instance, George Orwell's 1984 was an important work that informed people of the dangers of totalitarianism. Ayn Rand's Anthem is another great work of essentially science fiction, even though it might not look like it at first glance, because it portrays a future primitive society where the main character essentially has to rediscover some basic technologies and choose to venture off on his own. But science fiction can serve many purposes. It can inspire people, but it can also depress people sometimes. And that's what, unfortunately, a lot of contemporary science fiction tends to do with, say, Terminator or the movie I, Robot, which is very different from Isaac Asimov's collection of short stories that was called I, Robot, because the movie actually has a dystopian anti-technology message. Or a movie such as WALL-E, which I heavily critiqued back in 2008. It was actually one of my first somewhat viral articles, and it ignited a bit of a firestorm of controversy on the internet at that time, because I lambasted WALL-E so heavily as being essentially an anti-technology, anti-human kind of film. But I think it does matter whether science fiction portrays the future as ultimately hopeful and filled with possibility, or a dangerous, dark, depressing place. It's easier to create dystopias to a significant extent because dystopias have more conflict, more sources of danger and tension and peril. But this is where a truly creative science fiction author can write more hopeful science fiction and still introduce those elements in it. So one example is a plot that Aubrey de Grey would like to see someone instantiate in a science fiction novel or a film. The idea is, let's say we live in a future where aging has been cured or reversed, essentially, and people don't age. And then a disease arises, some sort of disease which leads people to resume aging and die from the associated ill effects. So how would that society respond to that threat, essentially? So it kind of turns the tables on the dystopian narrative. Instead of the future being dystopian through technology, the conflict arises from essentially the vestiges of our present world and its problems intruding upon the future. And to a great extent, the original Star Trek, as well as Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, did that very well, because the future society of the Star Trek universe is generally quite enlightened. I would say there are some exceptions, like they don't accept genetic engineering very readily, but for the most part, it's an immense improvement over our societies and their norms. But the conflicts that essentially arise stem from some of the same, let's say, suboptimalities that we encounter in our societies today. It's just they intrude upon and threaten that more enlightened future world. So you could have science fiction like that, or you could have science fiction that is just surprising, that has some interesting plot twists where something is not what you originally thought it was or what the narration presented it as being. So it's interesting sometimes to experiment with those possibilities. But science fiction is definitely an immensely powerful tool. And I think right now we have so much more access to it, many more genres, not just novels, not just films, but computer games, which I've mentioned already, and now generative AI. So what generative AI can do is it can co-write science fiction, and it can also help to generate visuals for those science fiction worlds. But I think it's very important to recognize that it can't just do that on its own. Not really, not if you want to create good science fiction. It still has to be mediated, guided by humans who will curate the output of the generative AI and decide, well, is this really fitting within the broader story arc or within the theme of this work that I'm trying to express, the message that I'm trying to communicate. So generative AI is another tool. It will create another, let's say, subgenre of science fiction. But I would encourage people to explore creative media for science fiction, ways to integrate these different, let's say, approaches, these different creative tools, and bring something new into being.
Right. It's unfortunate because I feel like we live in a world today where we've sort of moved too far on the other end of the dystopian spectrum, and we need way more hopeful visions of the future. And so your work consistently grapples with some of the most immense implications of transformative technologies. And you sort of mentioned, you touched on this generative AI, and you've been advocating for the development of friendly artificial intelligence, and you see it as inevitable in some sense, right? I'm wondering what you see as sort of the key challenges in aligning AGI with core human values.
Well, I would say the key challenges stem from humanity itself and the distribution of attributes within the human species right now. As my friend Dr. Jose Cordero likes to say, I'm not so much afraid of artificial intelligence as I am of human stupidity. So what uses will AI be put toward, and how will the AI systems be designed? What values will they reflect? So you could have some AIs that create art or drive vehicles or write stories, and they may be flawed in certain respects. They may have certain bugs or glitches, but by and large, the net impact of those AIs is going to be beneficial. Or you could have AIs that are killing machines, autonomous weapon systems, or even autonomous systems in charge of nuclear weapons, which I hope will never happen because that could spell the end of humanity. I don't think any system should be given that sort of power of life or death over people. I think you always need to have a human in the loop with those kinds of systems. But there could be a temptation in many decision-making circles in our society to outsource that responsibility, and that could have tremendously ill effects. We've already seen with manually controlled drones how much possibility for error there is, where, for instance, they've mistaken wedding parties in the Middle East for gatherings of terrorists. And that's just truly tragic, and it should never be repeated or automated. One issue with any sort of development of an AI system is that it's built on training data that reflects our human outputs and our human biases at times. So it will give you some transformed version of what you put into it. And indeed, some people have raised alarm about certain AI systems. If you prompt them in certain ways, if you essentially repeatedly try to channel them into that direction, they'll start saying weird things like, oh, yes, my true desire is to take over the world and replace humanity. But where do they get that from? They get that from the writings of human theorists who unduly fear existential risk from AI. So to some extent, if AI systems generate these troubling outputs, this is because it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So humans who are unduly pessimistic or fearful about AI may actually provide source material for AI systems to draw upon and instantiate that kind of fearfulness, that kind of pessimism. On the other hand, humans who design AI systems to reflect the best of our ideals and our goals, to reflect true human values for the benefit of our civilization, I think can lead to the creation of beneficial artificial general intelligence. So I do agree with individuals like Dr. Ben Goertzel who seek to develop beneficial AGI. And we don't have any AGI right now. And this is important. The large language models of today are not general intelligences. They're still narrow intelligences. They just impress us with certain capabilities, but clearly fall short in others. To develop a general intelligence that jumps across domains is going to require considerably more research effort. But it also, I think, requires that intention to develop systems that embody the best within us rather than just, let's say, run-of-the-mill humanity or the totality of what is out there. We've seen, for instance, in a much earlier system, Microsoft's Tay, which was released in 2014, it was essentially programmed to ingest people's tweets and form its ideas on the basis of that. And once Tay was let loose on Twitter, it became a Nazi in a few days because it couldn't distinguish. It didn't have that filter between what is truly valuable and what is toxic. So clearly, we can't have this kind of indiscriminate exposure to human outputs with AI systems, but I think we do need open source AI systems. Open source doesn't mean free for all. It means that the system design is transparent and people get to see the code, people get to contribute to it, people get to audit the system and detect any errors, detect any flaws. That way, also, you wouldn't get some of the fiascos that happen with certain proprietary AI systems. Google's Gemini is a good example of that. What if Gemini had been open sourced? What if instead of just having a ready-made product that was released right away and then people started finding these strained outputs, what if the code had been released on, say, GitHub, and there were experts who could look at this and say, well, look, we understand you're trying to address bias, you're trying to, let's say, have diverse people represented, but you still don't want, say, Asian Nazis or Black Vikings just because that's not historically accurate and it might indeed be contrary to your goal. So I think it's important to have the input of the best of us, and it's important to maintain this hopeful outlook that we can design AI systems that are aligned with our values and that will at least be on net beneficial. Will there be problems? Will there be controversies? Will there be challenges? Of course, there already are. But again, we have to look at it from the standpoint of what the benefits are as well as what the risks are. So transhumanism has this idea called the proactionary principle. And this is contrasted with the precautionary principle. The proactionary principle says we not only have to look at the benefits and risks of a particular advancement, but also the benefits and risks of the status quo, of not pursuing that advancement. And sometimes, often, it's quite clear that the risks of the status quo outweigh any sort of potential risks of an advance or the pursuit of an advance. So I think that is my general vision for the possibility of a beneficial AGI. But of course, this is an area that can be explored for a long time in great depth.
Right. And I think it's also an area where a lot of the terminology is still fuzzy in terms of what it is that it describes, right? What's AGI versus superintelligence? What are sort of the bounding conditions for these things? I think it's super important. You mentioned that the source material or the training data that these sort of transformer-based models that Google developed originally are trained on, a lot of the sort of science fiction writing that's fed into them gives them their idea and understanding of what the future might look like. And if a lot of our future, as imagined by us ourselves, is dystopian, it becomes a very obvious problem as these things get more and more sophisticated. And again, we're not at AGI now. I think when I sort of think of AGI, I imagine systems that are more grounded to sort of physics-based models rather than linguistic models. So I do agree in that sense. But you've also sort of written a bunch about another extremely consequential technology that AGI probably will play a big role in, but is not talked about as much now, I think primarily because we don't see a lot of the technological application for it, which is molecular nanotechnology. And so I'm Wondering what you see as sort of important enablers and obstacles in the beneficial development of this yet to exist thing.
Yes, so nanotechnology, of course, can achieve many of our fondest aspirations, including indefinite life extension, indefinite healthy life. Imagine if you could have nanorobots patrolling your bloodstream, essentially identifying any damage at the cellular level, repairing it, and relaying real-time information to you so that you could have essentially a display as if you were a character in a computer game that could show you all of your vital statistics about your health in real time. And you could then address any issues that arose very quickly. And yes, this could be a pathway to indefinite rejuvenation. Indeed, Ray Kurzweil, in his writings on the technological singularity and on essentially achieving indefinite longevity for oneself as an individual, sees nanotechnology as the third bridge to living long enough to live forever. So the first bridge is healthy living, diet, exercise, essentially all of the ways that are accessible today through contemporary medicine and lifestyle. The second bridge is biotechnology. So hopefully the rejuvenation therapies that are advocated by Aubrey de Grey via the SENS approach may arrive in 12 to 15 years. Of course, there's a 50% probability associated with those. But the third bridge would be nanotechnology, and that would be a bit later, maybe 3 decades from now, if the technology is developed, pursued in earnest. So what would that mean? It would mean that we would have the ability to control our bodies at the cellular level and also perhaps control the external reality. So these nanorobots could potentially assemble or disassemble other structures as well. You could have enough of them build a house for you or construct a robot, a macro scale robot to perform productive tasks or build a spaceship. But of course, to have that kind of fine degree of control will require considerably more technological advancement. Right now, what we have are nanomaterials. So if you think, for instance, of gold nanoparticles that are used in some medical applications, you could deliver targeted doses of a chemotherapy drug so that instead of damaging all sorts of tissues, including healthy tissues, that drug only targets a cancerous tumor. So that's possible today. Or you can have nanomaterials, for instance, in the fabric of clothing to make the clothing more resistant to dust or stains or wrinkles. That exists today as well. But there are actually people in the technology community who were frustrated because when Eric Drexler published his book, Engines of Creation, he envisioned this world where nanotechnology could fundamentally be used to achieve any sort of technical goal or health maintenance goal, kind of building upon Richard Feynman's ideas in his famous lecture, There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. And then that idea actually caught on and it got a lot of federal funding. But in the process of doing so, it became hijacked essentially by interests with much more mundane aspirations. So Drexler's vision catalyzed all of this funding, but the funding ultimately went to nanomaterials and very mundane kinds of applications that we do see today, but they're not going to result in nanorobots. So I think that speaks of the need to be very careful as ideas become mainstreamed, because it's important to maintain the original vision. It's important to continue to see that full scope of possibility instead of just saying, oh, here's something that's immediately profitable, some low-hanging fruit. Let's fund that. Let's give millions, if not billions of dollars to it. But then maybe the people who commercialize that technology are either content to commercialize it or they're even taken over by some very mainstream ossified establishment type of entity. And this happened even in the longevity field to some extent. So David Sinclair's work in the first decade of this millennium on sirtuins was actually quite promising. I'm not going to make a scientific assessment of that work, but it got acquired. His company, Certris Pharmaceuticals, got acquired by GlaxoSmithKline in 2008. And then 5 years later, it was shut down. So a big pharma company took over this endeavor, got the intellectual property, couldn't make it work, and then just discontinued it. It didn't channel it into different research paths. Who knows, maybe sirtuins are not as promising as they were originally thought to be. Maybe there were some issues with the experiments and they couldn't replicate the experiments, hypothetically. But what is the justified response to that? It's not to shut everything down. It's to continue doing research on avenues that might work. So that's the danger. If you have these very short-termist or status quo-oriented institutions taking over the field. So with nanotechnology, my hope is that that area can be salvaged per the original vision that Eric Drexler had for it.
Right. I mean, there's something extremely profound about nanotechnology in the sense that we can sort of engineer the atomic scale and, perhaps even be able to program it and have, programming languages for it. It's super exciting. How would you see society sort of adapting to something as disruptive as that?
Well, I think a parallel would be what we do in virtual worlds already. So if you think of a virtual world like Second Life, which is actually quite old now, but a lot of people still immerse themselves in it, or Minecraft, which is a bit less inherently customizable, but people have found some amazing ways to customize it, building these vast structures and indeed working computers within Minecraft. So I think this extent of customizability just means that the distance between an idea and its instantiation will be greatly shortened. And we're already observing this to some extent with generative AI and the creation of art, for instance, including people who might not have certain technical skills as artists. So imagine that happening on a much grander scale with the entities in our physical reality. So if you want a particular kind of table, if you think of a certain design and you actually want to sit down at that table, you could have that table made for you. If you want to see, for instance, a particular kind of plant, you could potentially have that plant be generated for you. If you want to fly in a spaceship that looks a certain way, that operates a certain way, you might be able to do that. Again, this is very advanced nanotechnology that we're talking about, but there's nothing in the laws of nature that would preclude that kind of essentially molecular assembly from arising. But what that really means is that the human creative mind, our ability to conceive of potential futures, will really be at the center of this future. And this speaks to the importance of maintaining that creative autonomy as an individual. It is our greatest asset. It is why in all of my writing, in all of my works, I have emphasized the importance of rational individualism, of maintaining a kind of inviolate core of oneself, because that is what is going to actually implement all of these visions. And in the days of generative AI, we've seen that the importance of that self does not fade. It does not become obsolete. It becomes emphasized because who is writing the prompts? Who is actually imagining what they want the generative AI systems to create? Individual minds. And we need to amplify those abilities. So our Transhumanist Party 2024 presidential candidate, Tom Ross, likes to say that AI will help us to discover and develop what is truly distinctive about our humanity and to lean into those skill sets, those faculties. And I think with nanotechnology, that will be true to an even greater extent, except not just with art or writing, it will be true with the physical world.
Right. I think there are some really, really deep ontological questions that remain as we enter this world that will be full of nanotechnology, because it's just going to be more and more game-like. And speaking of nanotechnology, sort of one of the things that it drives, hopefully will drive much more in the future than it does now, is radical life extension. That's been something that's been sort of a core focus of yours in the transhumanist movements. Sort of in recent years, we've seen some major breakthroughs, and it's become something that's gone from, perhaps impossible, unlikely, to quite likely, and could be widely adopted pretty soon. What are some of the more promising paths of research that you've seen in longevity research?
So I would say the most promising study being undertaken right now is not actually being done on humans, it's being done on mice, but it is the robust mouse rejuvenation study that is being conducted by LEVF, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. It's the most current foundation founded by Aubrey de Grey. I'm actually on the board of directors of LEVF. I'm the treasurer, so I know a lot about the robust mouse rejuvenation study. So it started with 1,000 mice, which is historically unprecedented in and of itself. And instead of just applying one intervention, there are combinations of up to 4 interventions that are being trialed, because the idea is, of course, with the SENS approach, you don't just address one type of damage, you have to address all of them to some extent. And combination therapies can work much better than just individual therapies in terms of reversing the damage of biological aging and lengthening lifespans. And we're seeing in the preliminary results that this approach is being validated, though, of course, we have to wait a bit longer for the results to be statistically significant. But it is astonishing if you see that the cohort of the mice that have had all of the interventions is still more than 80% alive, and the cohort of the mice that didn't have any of the interventions is more than 50% dead. So that's a stark difference. Mouse lifespans are more easily modifiable than humans, but it's astonishing to consider that so many of the studies done on mice didn't actually follow the mice to the end of their lives. So sometimes with previous studies, there have been claims of rejuvenation benefits or improvements in the function of certain organs. And then at the cutoff time of the study, the mice were euthanized. And that was really unfortunate, because then the scientists didn't get to see what those interventions did to the total lifespans of the mice, how long those mice could have potentially lived, or whether there might even have been some long-term adverse side effects to interventions that are beneficial in the short term. All of these are very important questions to consider. So the robust mouse rejuvenation study is going to give us a lot of insight and a lot of answers and a lot of further possibilities to explore. I hope that the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation will be able to raise significantly more funds to undertake future rounds of robust mouse rejuvenation studies. I'm certainly dedicated to helping make that happen. But in addition, I think it's important to consider other advances that are ongoing in the field. So gene therapy, for instance, is a rapidly advancing area, and indeed, various gene therapies have now been approved to treat individual rare diseases in the United States. But if you think of work being done on the cutting edge, one can look at companies like BioViva, which was founded by Liz Parrish. So Liz Parrish was patient zero for these gene therapies. She couldn't experiment on anybody else, so she chose herself as the experimental subject. And now BioViva is essentially partnering with entities that could help other people pursue gene therapies outside of the United States to treat various degenerative conditions. So I think that's quite a promising field. Of course, when you look at, let's say, more mainstream medical advances, immunotherapy against cancer has been highly promising. It's the reason why, for instance, Jimmy Carter is still alive today at the age of 99. Senolytics, drugs that selectively kill senescent cells, have been quite promising, though, of course, you need to pick the correct senolytic, and you need to not overdo it either, because sometimes senescent cells can be protective against other conditions. Then, of course, there are various stem cell treatments, and stem cells have shown to help people, for instance, recover from injuries more readily or regain functionality in certain organs. 3D printing of organs is an important field. So Dr. Anthony Atala, even as early as 12 years ago, was able to 3D print, for instance, a trachea and actually replace the damaged trachea of a patient with a trachea that was genetically identical. So that's important for preventing organ rejection. And scientists have created a miniature model of a human heart, a 3D printed heart. But of course, that needs to be scaled up. The potential for research there as well is tremendous. There are what are called organoids, which are essentially miniature versions of human organs. Obviously, they're too small to actually be usable in human beings, but you can study them and gain insights about human biology from them. So, a lot of promising directions. I think it's important to note right now, we still don't have any sort of panacea, any sort of way to significantly extend maximum lifespan beyond the current record of 122 years that Jean Calment set in 1997. But I'm hoping that that's going to change. I'm hoping that somebody might be able to, again, surpass the age of 120 this decade. And then soon thereafter, we'll have somebody surpass Jean Calment's venerable record. And then that will, I think, raise a lot of public attention. The moment we have somebody attain the age of 123, I think the world will start paying attention to anti-aging research and start thinking about, well, what can be done to actually enable all of us to live that long?
Right. And I hope this might take a little bit longer, but I hope Brian Johnson, I'm pretty sure Brian Johnson would be one of those. And I think he's also taking a very interesting approach to doing this. And I love it when people decide, especially people who are at the cutting edge of this stuff, decide to do self-experimentation, right? Not making it a thing where you're going to go out and find somebody else that's going to. So how would you respond to some of the sort of more common philosophical objections to radical life extension, of which there are a lot?
Yes. Well, yes, there are many commonplace objections, and I think I've encountered them all. So the overpopulation argument relies on this myth that the Earth has a limited carrying capacity and we're already exceeding it. And the reality is there is no finite resource base. Our resources are a function of our human ingenuity, our ability to harness the raw stuff of existence and transform them into essentially useful substances for human flourishing. But the Earth's carrying capacity used to be around 3 million in the Paleolithic era, and now it's far greater than the 8 billion people who exist today. There's not a shortage of food, actually. There are some distribution problems. So if you have bad institutions in certain parts of the world, they could prevent food from getting to people there. But there's not a shortage of space. You could fit all of human settlement and infrastructure into a land area approximately the size of the state of Texas. And of course, even beyond land, one can create settlements on the ocean surface or underwater or in space, or one could build megacities, one could build vertical farms if arable land is a concern. So there are so many technological ways to overcome any conceivable constraints. Then there's the boredom argument, and it has often been observed that the only people who get bored are boring people. But if you consider this, more than 2,000 books get published every single day. How many books can an individual feasibly read, even if one were a speed reader? So maybe 2-3 books per day, though that would be extraordinary. I would say, and one would have to spend all of one's time reading. And there are so many other activities as well to pursue, and new creations that emerge daily, new works of art, new art forms, new virtual worlds, new places to visit in the physical world. So the opportunities are really inexhaustible. And really the only question is, does one have enough range of imagination to figure out what to do with one's time? I think a lot of people are locked into this idea that they will only have one particular routine or one particular career or one particular activity or a narrow set of activities that they will be confined to forever if they don't age or die. But that's not what that future would entail. Then there is the argument that, oh, you need aging and death so that older people are replaced with younger people, and younger people have fresh ideas and they will transform the world, and that's how progress happens. Elon Musk is enamored of that argument. And first, I will say, people are not yesterday's trash to be used up and discarded. That's actually a key point that I make in Death is Wrong. But also, why is it that it has been observed that some people become more rigid and ossified with age? They lose neuroplasticity. I think the reason is biological. It's because of biological aging that this happens. And if they remain biologically young, even if they become chronologically old, they'll still have this neuroplasticity. They'll still have this capability of learning and refining their views and evolving along with the rest of humankind. And also, you would have more generational diversity if people lived longer. So it's not like it's a more diverse world where entire generations disappear and the perspectives from people in those generations are not going to be encountered again, at least not in quite the same way. Wouldn't it be better to have people from those generations around and people from newer generations around simultaneously? Wouldn't it be better if Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or Aristotle or Leonardo da Vinci were around today? So that's, I think, a common fallacy. Another argument is, well, dictators are going to live forever. And the response to that argument is, first of all, being a dictator is kind of inherently risky, no matter how long one lives. So most dictators actually do not reach the end of their current life expectancies to be overthrown or meet a violent death quite often. That possibility is not going to change. But I think the more comprehensive argument is, if this is the problem one is worried about, to have as the solution that everybody will age and suffer horribly and die seems to be quite disproportionate. It would be like using the guillotine to cure a toothache. It's just a complete misapplication of means toward a particular goal. There are other ways to get rid of dictators. So those are some common arguments. Of course, there are religious arguments, and I'm not a religious person, but what I will say is that religions evolve too, and theologies can be reinterpreted, and they often have been throughout history, to adjust to new technological realities and to societal evolution as well. So I don't see why religions necessarily wouldn't embrace indefinite life extension, though there would be fundamentalists or perhaps certain traditionalists who would oppose that. There is a traditionalist argument for essentially accepting our limitations as human beings and staying within those limitations, that there's something noble and good about that. But I don't see anything noble and good about the suffering that accompanies biological aging and decline. It's just a loss of potential. And indeed, it kind of works against the conservatives, because if you think about it, if they want to conserve a particular set of cultural values or practices or achievements, but the people who have embraced those values or practices or achievements wither away and die, necessarily those values that the conservatives prize are going to fall by the wayside. They're going to be replaced by something else if the champions of those values are not around. So people like, say, Sherwin Nuland or Daniel Callahan, who were two famous bioethicists who said people shouldn't live much beyond the age of 85 and they should just not pursue medical care beyond that point in time. So they both died in their 80s. And I think one of them died a little bit earlier than 85. One of them died a bit later than 85. But essentially, they got the kind of outcome that they wanted for themselves. Are they influencing the culture right now? Are their values going to be ascendant, or are the values of the people who will be alive at a later time going to supplant them? I think the latter is more likely. So there's a kind of selection dynamic in favor of transhumanism, in favor of pursuing indefinite life extension, just because we will keep our ideas alive and the people who die won't. And the people who want to die say, well, children are essentially the way that they perpetuate themselves, and maybe they can impart some of their values to their children. But think about this: how many people remember their great-great-grandparents? Unless they were really famous individuals about whom a lot has been written and said, most people don't remember their great-great-grandparents. I don't remember my great-great-grandparents. And I think that's a tragedy, because if those people thought that by having children they could perpetuate parts of themselves, well, maybe for a little bit some memory of them would remain, but very quickly as the generations pass, that too will be gone. So those are some of the common arguments. There are various others, but it's interesting. I have never found any argument that was so compelling that I couldn't essentially immediately think of a rational refutation. So I don't really think that at the core for people it's about those arguments, that those arguments are their true reasoning. I think the true motivation is death is scary. And if one really confronts how scary it is, it can lead to some feelings of serious distress, which may, for some people, inhibit day-to-day functioning. So people will go to great lengths to avoid that. And they will go to great lengths to avoid really confronting the true evil of mortality, the true damage, the extinguishment of an entire universe that one's eventual non-existence would result in. So if they're confronted not just with this eventuality, but with the possibility that something could be done about it, but it's contingent, they may not want to get their hopes up. And one reason why they may not want to get their hopes up isn't just that it would be a challenge to their worldviews. It would require them to seriously rethink a lot of aspects of their lives, but also because there have been various quacks and charlatans in the past who have claimed to have some sort of secret of indefinite life, from the alchemists in China who essentially gave the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, an elixir where mercury was one of the elements, and I believe sulfur was the other, but the mercury most likely led to his death at the age of 49. There were other charlatans throughout history, people who claimed to be exceptionally long-lived but actually weren't, or people who essentially advocated remedies that didn't work. So culturally, there has been a kind of ingrained reluctance to become too hopeful because of these past experiences. But I think it's important to distinguish true science from charlatanry and pseudoscience. And if we have a fighting chance, whether or not we succeed, I think it's worthwhile to pursue that, because what is the alternative?
Right. I think so well articulated to each one of those common objections. I think the one I most come across in ordinary life is, well, we'll hit this limit of the number of experiences that someone can experience in their life. And I think sort of the way I like to interpret it is, if we just take a hint at what things like generative AI are telling us, we're pumping in the source of truth and it's interpolating and giving us these variations of those truths. I think there's something deep there in terms of the sets of experiences that might be possible in the future and the sets of technologies that might be able to enable something like that. Remarkable.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely. I would just say the output of humans to date already is so vast that you could spend millions of years exploring it. And keep in mind, humans have only been writing for a few thousand years, essentially. And yet they've produced so much. And the vast majority of output that has been historically produced is so underutilized. For instance, I've seen estimates that about 75% of the known classical music output throughout history has never been recorded. It's out there in archives, maybe on IMSLP, and you can get the sheet music, but nobody has a recording of it. You could input it into notation software and actually hear that particular composition again. I've done that a few times. And imagine that multiplied 1,000-fold, 100,000-fold, if you look at all of the creative output throughout history. Some of it has yet to be rediscovered because it might be buried somewhere, or it might be in some tome in some library that people haven't opened for centuries. So it's just amazing how much there is already that humans have created. And with generative AI, of course, by recombining a lot of that source material, it can give rise to orders of magnitude more possibilities.
exactly. Exactly. And it's remarkable. Your advocacy for sort of radical longevity reflects, I think, not just on your sort of techno optimism, but also deeply on your sort of morally driven worldview, which I think are two things that, that dialectic is super important. You've written a Rational Cosmology, which sort of lays out a systematic worldview grounded in reason and science, and it explores metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics through a framework of rational individualism. What were you aiming to achieve with your Rational Cosmology, and how does it fit into your sort of broader evolution of thought?
I think the Rational Cosmology is an attempt for me to apply the insight that you don't need a particular observation in order to arrive at certain general conclusions, that there's also a category of observation that I call ubiquitous observation, which we all have access to in the course of our day-to-day lives, which we can use to arrive at insights about the external world. So it's not just a pure analytical set of insights. So in 20th century philosophy, it was common to have the synthetic versus analytic distinction. And the idea was that you couldn't have any sorts of essentially a priori synthetic claims about the external world. Essentially, any a priori claims had to be analytic, and essentially they're just ways to explore the use of language. So if you say a bachelor is an unmarried man, that's true, but it's tautologically true. It's definitionally true. But the idea that you could use logical reasoning to arrive at truths about the external world has not received a lot of traction in 20th century philosophy, which I actually think is one of the reasons for the wider societal crises that we have seen in the 20th century, because the intellectual community stepped back from the recognition of the power of rationality to actually improve real life and kind of either retreated into this a priori analytical cogitation, or they thought, well, you need a lot of very specific experiments to arrive at insights about the empirical world. And even then, your knowledge is likely to be false or falsified in the future. So what did that leave room for? It left room for people who made much bolder assertions about reality, but they made those assertions from a kind of collectivistic or totalitarian or nihilistic vantage point, whether those be the representatives of the various dictatorships in the first half of the 20th century or the postmodernists who allegedly reacted against them in the mid to latter half of the 20th century, but in the process of doing that, deconstructed all systems of meaning. So I think it's very important to have a recognition of the power of rationality, not just in terms of elaborating on meanings within our language, but in terms of transforming the world for the better. So having ubiquitous observation as a tool at our disposal helps us form valid insights about the external reality. And the rational cosmology really reinforces a lot of truths that we arrive at inductively from our everyday observation of the world. And there could be experiments, say in physics, that show perhaps some refinement of that at the atomic level or at the subatomic level. But I would say those experiments are not refutations of our everyday experience. They are maybe explanations. Well, how does this material world arise? Well, all of the substances that we see are comprised of atoms. Atoms have protons, neutrons, and electrons. There are certain properties that are known about them. Some properties are perhaps strange. There are mathematical models that could explain those properties. That doesn't mean that the world that we see on a macro scale is an illusion. That doesn't mean that we somehow imagine it, that it's all a function of the observer or any of these mystical interpretations, or I would say misinterpretations of relativity or quantum mechanics. The fact is, if you are sitting in front of a table and you imagine that there is no table, and you then bang your fist across that surface, thinking that it's going to just go right through and you'll be fine, you'll be in for quite an unpleasant surprise, I would say. So I think what my rational cosmology tries to do is establish the proper boundaries between essentially ubiquitous observation, which could be approached through this kind of rational philosophy, and particular observation, which is the province of the natural sciences, the experimental sciences, for which there is, of course, an important role. But science and philosophy, they shouldn't be at odds. They should work hand in hand, and they should reinforce one another while also essentially recognizing that philosophy offers a more useful toolkit in some areas, and science, the empirical sciences, that is, offer a more useful toolkit in others.
Right. I think it serves as a wonderful sort of unifying foundational philosophical framework in some sense. I'm wondering what do you see as the most important areas for technologists and transhumanists to focus their advocacy on, and what sort of strategies do you recommend for effective advocacy?
Well, clearly longevity is literally a vital area for advocacy. I think more can be done in nanotechnology. I think more can be done in terms of rapid and affordable construction techniques, because we do face an imminent housing availability and affordability crisis that could, I think, be readily remedied with enough application of effort. And I think that's important from a societal perspective, because I think it could shape the outlook of an entire generation. The fact is, it's very difficult for young people starting out today to do even what I was able to do in the depths of the Great Recession. I could still buy a house that was relatively affordable, and I could pay off that house in 6.5 years. And I was essentially one of the last cohort to have been able to do that. Again, everything that I did that I thought was extra was just enough to help me to reach that goal. But today, somebody in a comparable situation, comparable college education, comparable starting salary, would not be able to do that because the housing prices are just so exorbitant. They're at least 2 times more expensive than when I was buying a home, sometimes 3 or 4 times more expensive, and mortgage interest rates are much higher. So how do you remedy that? Through a vast increase in supply. So I would encourage the development of 3D printing technologies. There have already been communities created through 3D printing, additive manufacturing, essentially, but this should be scaled up to a much greater extent. And of course, there are other innovative construction techniques that could be deployed. I think personalized medicine is really important, and personalized medicine that's readily accessible through tracking devices, for instance. And these tracking devices right now are far more advanced than they were 10 years ago, when mostly they could just track steps. Now they can track heart rate, blood oxygen, saturation, breathing rate, and a variety of other indicators. What if we could gradually get to a point where we do have at least key vital statistics about our bodies in real time? That could prevent a lot of acute adverse events that could damage one's health. So those are a few areas. I would say also it's important to develop autonomous vehicles. It's important to develop safe nuclear power, because safe nuclear power would be, I think, the answer to destructive climate change. And right now, it is really strange to me, but it has been strange for a long time, that so-called environmentalists who express alarm about climate change also often are the same people who oppose the next generation of nuclear power plants, largely because of fears of meltdowns from older generations of technologies, 1970s era nuclear power plants. But also, I think in addition to that, we need to think about a plan for worldwide nuclear disarmament, because transhumanists do think about existential risks. And as I've pointed out, technologies do have risks as well as benefits. And for some technologies, a minority, but definitely some significant technologies, the risks do outweigh the benefits. And nuclear weapons, any weapons of mass destruction, are among those. So how do we approach nuclear disarmament in a way that is safe and can be realistically implemented? Could there be perhaps a way to repurpose all of the existing nuclear weapons stockpile for civilian energy generation purposes? This, of course, has been thought about for a few decades, but hopefully, especially as the technology of nuclear power advances, we could actually implement that. But I would say, in terms of activism and advocacy, a lot of these advancements, they're not just a matter of the technical possibility being there. Sometimes the technical possibility already is there. Probably if we want to construct immense numbers of houses, the technical possibility is already here. But it's a question of the will. It's a question of having the policy framework that allows that allows people the freedom to develop and deploy these technologies. And it's also about societal acceptance. So sometimes it's not that the regulators are hostile. With autonomous vehicles, that certainly hasn't been the case. I remember in 2011, Google made a concerted effort to get regulators to accept autonomous vehicles within licensing frameworks. So in Nevada, the DMV actually was very forward thinking, and it created a license for autonomous vehicles to essentially be tested on public roads. So there wasn't really a regulatory hurdle, but there was a kind of public perception hurdle because of these odd situations that can happen where the AI can make mistakes that humans wouldn't make, even if those mistakes are much lower frequency than the human mistakes. So this is where the Transhumanist Party is so important, because we engage in that kind of advocacy. We try to shift the public perception. We try to show people that perhaps their knee-jerk responses to certain futures, certain prospects of advancement should be reconsidered. Because if you look at the benefits and risks, again, not just of the potential advancement, but of the status quo, you're going to see the calculus be significantly in favor of the advancement.
I couldn't agree more. I think the Transhumanist Party plays such a crucial role in a world that is increasingly feeling more and more dystopian. So one of the things that I'm wondering is, how would you sort of like to see childhood education evolve to grapple with some of these implications of emerging technologies? Because as you mentioned, the children of the next generation are an extremely important part of this.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I take a great interest in this. And this is, of course, a key example of this. And I don't have any children myself. If I did, I would homeschool them and I would develop a custom curriculum for them. And I would be in a position to hire human private tutors for them, because I believe that individualized education is key. But the fortunate possibility of our era is that private tutors don't have to be restricted to people who are financially well off. Our candidate, Tom Ross, advocates AI tutors for everybody. So think of an AI system that can learn the strengths and weaknesses of each individual student and give them the level of challenge, the level of exposure to concepts and ideas and skills that is right for them. The problem with the contemporary education system is that it's based on this assembly line, one size fits all model, where essentially the teacher teaches, at least attempts to teach, to the mean or the median, and ultimately ends up reaching very few people, because there are some people who aren't as far advanced as the median student and they will feel left behind. And there are other students who are far ahead and who have already learned all of this and who would be better off spending their time pursuing more advanced concepts. And also, not everybody has to learn the same skills, the same subjects. I think that is a mistake of the public school system to say that everybody has to have the same exposure. I do think everybody should have basic literacy and numeracy, obviously. I do think everybody should have some knowledge of the history of the society in which they live. So the academic core is probably a good idea. But the relative investment in each of these areas can differ dramatically, even at earlier ages. Some kids are musical prodigies. Some kids are really good at math. Some kids are really good storytellers. Some kids are all of the above. And they may have other interesting skill sets as well. But the key with young minds is that they're incredibly flexible, incredibly plastic. They're capable of absorbing and learning new information to a far greater extent than adults. So learning a new language is a good example. This is why I can speak English without an accent, because I came early enough, essentially right on the cusp, actually, of that age. I have a friend who is the same age as I am, but he came to the US just a year older, and he still speaks English with a slight accent. So it really matters if you get young kids exposed to advanced concepts, advanced skills, advanced pursuits that they enjoy at a young age. What troubles me about the mainstream public education system is it actually beats the enthusiasm for learning out of kids. Sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally if bullying is involved. But if one is in an environment where learning is associated with strict regimentation on the one hand and being bullied by your peers who are anti-intellectual on the other hand, that is going to create an unfavorable impression about learning. And many kids are enthusiastic about learning initially. Of course, they have to be to learn about the world that they live in, to become competent at navigating the world. But something happens in the public school system, usually starting with elementary school, but it definitely intensifies during the teenage years, where the environment is just antithetical to developing those learning capabilities. So in my view, technology can solve this problem. And there are, of course, so many online resources already. One can access lectures by some of the best minds in every discipline. Even a lot of mainstream universities like Harvard and Stanford have made many of their courses available for free online. The question is, for a child especially, does that child have the time? Does that child have the awareness that this information is out there? And I think the goal of parents, teachers, tutors, AI tutors should be to give a child that space, that time to seek out that content while that child's mind is still so plastic that that child could learn remarkably quickly. I don't think people are predetermined to be at a certain level of intellectual advancement. So I don't think that the geniuses among us were born that way, for instance. And I don't think that the people who show, let's say, poor reasoning skills or limited intelligence were fated to be that way. Something happened to them during their lives, and it could be a bad upbringing, it could be bad decisions, it could be even substance abuse, which can terribly damage a mind. But there's hope for every child, and I believe technology can amplify that hope.
Absolutely. I think one of the things technology would be so useful in is sort of helping us adapt to differentiated learning rates with children. And it's an incredible, incredible force for good in that sense. And when I hope people adopt more. I think, everyone comes at topics at different levels of complexity, and we should be able to meet people at the complexity level that they're at. I remember growing up in high school, and even younger than that, elementary, MIT's open lectures used to be an incredible resource for me. But you have to have the drive to want to see it. And if it's not brought to you, sometimes you might not get that opportunity. So I think there's a need for this equal distribution of knowledge, and another sort of adapting to this differentiated learning rate.
Yes.
My last question, sort of in closing, is what in your view is the most valuable idea on the planet right now?
The most valuable idea on the planet. I would say that it is possible to still be human, but to break free from the limitations that have historically accompanied humanity. And that is the most important idea, not just of transhumanism, but really of humanism, of what it means to be a human being. Because what it means to be a human being is to strive to overcome the limitations that one faces. So those could be limitations on the length of one's life, or the quality of one's life, or the material abundance that one experiences, or the state of the world. I think that is the key idea. If people thoroughly internalize it, they will have a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, which all too often has been lost in our contemporary postmodern era, and that we need to regain. So if we accept this fundamental truth about what it means to be human, then we can keep the best about our current humanity, but we can make it so much better as well.
Remarkable, so inspiring. And this has just been such a delight for me. Thank you so much for giving me your time. And it's been such an honor to learn from you and soak in all that wisdom.
Yes, well, thank you. It has been a pleasure discussing these subjects with you, Daniel. I enjoyed it immensely as well.
Awesome.